Wuthering Waves has excellent combat, a fun world to explore, and a story. It does have a story. So, I guess let's talk about it by looking at all of the acts in the prologue and chapter 1, and by the end, deciding the question, was it a train wreck? Does that still work? Subscribe to the Discord. Also, subscribe to my second channel, the Stray Sensei channel, where I do combat guides for gacha games. Thank you so much. Please subscribe. Before Wuthering Waves released, I already had my eye on the title, but not for the greatest of reasons. After some pretty harsh feedback, the development team of the game decided to make a lot of changes, and they made drastic changes to the story. And by changes, I mean they basically just wrote a new one. Earlier this year, the game's developer announced that a whopping 90% of the game's story was seeing a rewrite, and that was a really odd statement to me. Typically, these stories are so intertwined with everything in the open world and the intricacies of the characters that a full rewrite would be, well, near impossible. Let's look to just a few years ago. Gacha game stories were more so a springboard to get cool looking characters and to use them in their heavily menu driven and monetized game worlds. These games weren't so much about being immersed as they were about having a quick break on your commute and spending ass loads of money on ass. Gacha games weren't targeted towards normies for this exact reason, and so they were typically pretty niche in the wider gaming space. These games had a specific feel to them that turned off a large player base, and that's not even discussing the gacha mechanics themselves. This was the case until Genshin stepped onto the scene. Hoyoverse crafted a new standard for gacha games by creating a whole open world, one where exploration and getting immersed was the name of the game, where appealing to a wider gaming audience was key, where everything from the combat to the characters was tied back to the world at large and its story. So when a developer comes out, it just says that they're essentially trying to do what Genshin did by creating a large open world intent on exploration, and then says that they rewrote 90% of it. I had a hard time believing what I was hearing and what that would even really look like. What does it look like? Is the story actually any good? Did they do the impossible and write a story that set up an incredible world and characters after a large rewrite? One that will be unraveled for years to come? Well, let's see. Wuthering Waves' story feels like a Frankenstein's monster of ideas, all stitched together to create a really weird experience. The game begins with a great cutscene, one that feels like a bad trip, with a mysterious woman and seas in the sky. It's a pretty cool opener that has a lot of style to it. We then get awoken by two characters where one speaks about almost having to do mouth to mouth. Where have I seen this? We learn that our protagonist, dubbed Rover, has amnesia, but we don't have time for that. Look at this statue. Wait, we don't have time for that either. Look at this Discord mod. Wait, we're eating him. Hold on. It's Princess later. We don't have time for this. Beginning is a roller coaster in all the worst ways, and it's absolutely written with the subtlety of a fucking sledgehammer. Within the first 10 minutes of the game, we get jargon like Etheric sea, tacit fields and discords, echoes, elite classes, reverberations, Pangu terminals, Huanglong sentinels, Sonaro spheres, remnant energy, waveform phenomenon. Dr. Mario. There's so much that the game is throwing at you for, well, seemingly no reason. Why exactly do I need to know what these ideas are off the bat? This game is a long-running open-world gacha game, right? We shouldn't be bombarded with ideas so early, and we absolutely shouldn't be dealing with exposition about the world itself right as we start the game. Give us some time and space out these ideas. This isn't a 30-minute episode of an anime. This should be the setup to hundreds of hours, but the game seems intent on speedrunning its own ideas so that it can accomplish setup, which, well, we'll talk about what it's really setting up in a bit. Genshin Impact doesn't have a perfect beginning, but it certainly has an efficient one. At the beginning of the game, it's immediately explained to us that our protagonist's sibling was kidnapped by some unknown god and that they've been trying to find them. The cast is also just the Traveler and Paimon on this beach. With us having saved Paimon, she now vows to be our guide. So we walk off the beach to get our breath of the wild moment, symbolizing that, well, this hunt for our sibling might take longer than we think, but also that we're going to be learning about this world along with the Traveler. So within the first 5 minutes of the game, we have our primary cast and overarching hook for the entire game's story: find our sibling. It's an emotional hook attached to the character that we're playing. It needs to be noted here how quickly we understand what the goal is here. The world may be vast and the lore may be deep, but intrinsically, we know what our ultimate goal is: reunite the siblings. I don't compare these two games to say Genshin is perfect or that Wuthering Waves should be Genshin, but I think that Genshin's beginning is one of the best in the gacha space at establishing the overarching goal in a quick and efficient manner. I also think it's very, very obvious at this point that Genshin Impact was a huge inspiration to Wuthering Waves, and they're definitely not hiding it. So the initial setup in Genshin is over the overarching plot of the entire game, and done in record time. Then, on our way to the nearby city, a dragon flies overhead, and we begin to establish our second hook, Dvalin and Venti. Everything in Chapter 1 is in service of this hook, but the overarching hook about our sibling is still omnipresent, and we're even told that if the dragon threat is dealt with, the town will help us with our sibling. So there's a link. Always, in the back of our heads, we're thinking about what is going to happen with the sibling, but the exploration of Mondstadt and its issues with Dvalin is explained to us naturally, as the town is literally getting attacked. We're thrust into this dilemma too, but our character never forgets the larger overarching issue, finding their sibling. This is something that immediately humanizes the traveler, and I cannot stress enough how important that is for a story, and especially how important that is for a story that's supposed to last for literal years. Let's compare this to Wuthering Waves. We wake up knowing that we have amnesia, but it's not made into any sort of deal, and before we're given any time with the characters discussing this or our protagonists ruminating on it, we're immediately thrust in front of a god statue to then immediately be thrust in front of an enemy. All the while, we've been introduced to 4 characters and 50 million concepts. Also, we do get a Breath of the Wild moment, but I'll let it speak for itself.
There's only a short walk to reach Jinzhou.
This also speaks to a special jank about the game's storytelling as well, with voices being off in scenes, to hitting the continue button a little too soon, causing characters to stutter, to voices just like going away.
I've been keeping an eye on his condition through the street.
To whatever this masterpiece is.
わかる獣はほとんどいなかったけど、ごくわずかな成功者もいた。
And if we're going to talk about jank, we can't not discuss the English voices. Genshin is the top of the line when it comes to English dubbing, with everyone sounding excellent, even if you don't like their direction. Here, though, I'm not really sure there was voice direction because almost everybody sounds like they're asleep.
But there's one thing I'm 100% sure about you. You must be a resonator too.
Or that they're not sure what the context of certain scenes is.
Rover, about the sugar pearl.
Now, I don't want to blame the voice actors themselves, because when basically everybody sounds bad, I think it can easily be attributed to a lack of proper vocal direction, more so than the cast. And I also think this goes back to the writing. Every character has a stilted exposition type dialogue that would make the Luofu blush. Almost everyone for the first few hours sounds like a robot, with dialogue being interchangeable because almost all of it is exposition. There's no emotion or character motivation to be seen. Everyone feels like they could simply be replaced by an actual robot and nothing would change. I mean, literally, take Huanglong for example. Could she be deleted from the entire story? Well, yeah. It would take absolutely minimal rewrites to just get the mascot character out of the game. It's not like they're our guide. It seems like everybody in the city is fighting to help us, and they're not important for any role for the entirety of the story. Think of any of your favorite characters from fiction. Now, try and write them out of their respective stories. Can you actually do this without breaking the story that they're in? In about 99% of cases, the answer should be no. A central character should not be so superfluous that they can be written out of a story with relative ease, and almost every character in this story can be treated like this, with the exception of a few, who we'll get to. So what exactly is the story hook in Wuthering Waves? It seems to be getting your memories back, but we're not allowed to have this sit for any time at all because we have to speedrun all of this jargon and all of these events. And I think the reason the pacing is so off here is likely due to that rewrite that I spoke of. I don't think they had confidence in their own writing to allow us to care before throwing flashing lights at us. That's why within the first few minutes, we're experiencing so many different ideas. But what Wuthering Waves has forgotten is that variation is just one component to what makes an interesting story. Character writing and dialogue are others. And this game fumbles these two to such an insane extent that it's actually hard to express, like, I don't know, I'm kind of just writing at this point. Shit sucks. Just take this beginning. How many lines of dialogue can be classified as conversational and not expositional? It's a tepid, minute amount, and this is true quite literally for the entirety of the first chapter. All of it. From Act 1 to, as we'll see, Act 6. It feels more like I'm reading a glossary than characters speaking to one another. Genshin has problems with developing characters, where characters generally feel like they're in stasis after their introduction chapter. But here, there's no characters in sight. What makes Genshin's characters so excellent is this fact that they're distinct and unique from one another at their introductions to an impressive degree, honestly. Their designs also feel inspired, with each character being immediately characterized, even just from a silhouette. But here, I don't know what to do with this. I don't think these designs are necessarily bad, but they feel like they're trying too hard to be cool instead of trying to represent the characters that they're attached to, which actually makes a lot of sense and feels like a lot else here in the game. Character designs should start after a character has been characterized. A person should exist in identity, and then a palette and suit should be given to that identity. I always use Tetsuya Nomura as an example of the good and the bad of this. He's a key designer for Square Enix games and has worked on many different titles over the days, but my favorite designs of his are for characters that were written and conceptualized by other people, and then he simply just did the design. Take his Final Fantasy VII designs, or, my favorite, his The World Ends With You designs. They're incredible, and the little intricacies and color palettes chosen for these characters absolutely perfectly fit who they are. They're, in my opinion, perfect character designs for this reason. Then, take his designs from stories he himself has written. Like from the absolute worst sequel ever made, Neo: The World Ends With You. And then tell me what you can read from these characters. They're stale and hollow, and this comes from the fact that these characters are stale and hollow. That doesn't mean that the designs can't be cool. It just means that they're interchangeable and don't fit the identity that they're meant to map onto. And turns out that the character designs in Wuthering Waves underwent massive redesigns as early as the most recent beta, which again makes sense because I'm not really sure what any of these designs, well, what they say about the characters right now. Not to say all of the designs are bad, but they again feel uninspired and unlinked to who these people really are, and simply feel like they're there to look cool or to appeal to an audience. Which, for a gacha game, that is the case, but there's multiple layers to these things. Also, this tracks for who these characters are. If someone told me to make a design for this character, I'd probably just throw something together too, I guess. So back to the story. The uninspired robots tell us to go to the town and meet with Leia, or her actual name, Noelle. She's the head of this city, and she might know something about the memory loss, but we quickly realize that she's gone, but she's given us items that we need to unravel the mystery of. So we go on a scavenger hunt, which leads us to a villain group which was done on purpose so that they could be tricked by Noelle, because they stole the god of the region, and you might be tied to that god based on your past. And our first mission that we have is essentially the personification of Exposition, where we go to a lab and listen to people explain the concepts to us, ones that are meant to be a mystery, given to us by Madam Jinsa? Madam Jinshi? No, wait, damn it. Let me see how the game pronounces this.
Madame Jinshi was only a teenager, only showed their respect to Madame Jinshi. And Madame Jinshi, she's already from Madame Jinshi.
This quest is also not at all personalized to any of our established cast either. One of the reveals about the world is that there used to be a virus that plagued a region, and that it wasn't until a vaccine was made where people were safe. This would be a, perfect time to show how the characters that we're traveling with were affected by this, since they should be around that age, but nah. Not really. They talk about that time, but there's no concrete connection between it and the characters. And this continues the trend for our characters being able to be written out of the plot, but it also brings up a question that I had the entire story so far. Were any of these characters intended to be in the story? With the exception of Jinsha, in this chapter, everyone feels like they were slotted in for that sweet gacha promotion. These two do nothing other than explain, so they absolutely could be replaced by NPCs. And Huanglong and Chixia do absolutely nothing of value for this or future acts in this chapter. It's where it legitimately feels like they were thrown in at the last minute, like fluff in an essay where you're trying to reach a word count, or when you're trying to reach an 8-minute mark in a YouTube video. Did you know that YouTube derived its name from you as in you, and tube as in television? So we solve all the mysteries and make it to this village, where the story finally introduces its first character in person, Scar. And look, when I tell you I legit let out a sigh of relief when I was actually able to see someone emote for the first time, that's how low the bar was at this point. I mean, we went from receptionist to that stinky kid at the Magic the Gathering tournament, but like, it's something, right? This is likely the most interesting part of the entire game so far, as Scar goes on to explain that this world, well, it's pretty fucked up, in that the people of this village were met with a being who could grant wishes, but at a cost. That cost was each other's lives. Scar, surprisingly, seems to have a connection to this village too, which ticks the boxes that I spoke about before. But for some reason, our protagonist isn't a fan of him, so they fight, which I was a bit disappointed by because take me with you! So, after the fight, chapter 1 comes to a close. Wait, no? Actually, we return to the city to have a meeting with
Madame Jinshi,
where she explains that, well, the god of the area has been god-napped. She brings up prophecies and duties and such, because it seems like everyone in this world is told to do things, and very few people have minds of their own. It's especially annoying to see our protagonist just agree to go along with her when, at this point, we aren't really given much reason to trust either side. It's the same thing with other characters and us. We're randomly found, but it seems like everyone and their mom wants to befriend us and help us at any given time. There's nobody skeptical of us, and there's absolutely zero conflict outside of Scar when it comes to this. Speaking of, Scar is caught in a trap, and he's arrested. He reveals that Shinchan is meant to fight the god, but since we don't really know much about her, this reveal feels superfluous at this point. We literally just met her. So then, chapter 1 comes to a close. Wait, no, we're still going. We're told there's another organization in town that essentially tries to protect the world from another catastrophe like the one that happened in the past, and so we attempt to lure out its members by using Nahida. We do when we get 2 more characters who have personalities, Glasses and Little Girl. The organization that they work for seems interesting, but we quickly learn that this is, yet again, more setup. We're taken to some compound for more mystery boxing and setup to be explained about the rain, and then for these people to just go away. Little outside of explaining the world happens in this act, but we're now at Act 6, everybody. This is where people claim that the story gets good, and by good, there's fights in it. We're shown the General Jian, who is now the second character who not only has a character, but also a backstory. We're shown his connection to the war of the past and how it's ravaged the military. Our character enters the front line as we're told that the backwards rain brings with it hallucinations and vestiges of the past. But aside from Jian, none of our other characters experience any of this. Like, we're given an antidote later, but like, did the rain really do anything to us? Like, it spawned some monsters, but anything else? For a story that's supposedly about our main character's memory, we weirdly don't get the obvious choice here, which would be to have the rain show our protagonist some memories of his past. But oh well, we've got shit to fight. Robot Mannequin Avengers, assemble! They fight back the Horde, only for each of them to have to stay back. They all decide to stay back one by one. We meet up with the general. He asks us to be the commander for some reason, because I guess he's tired of being here too. And then we take on the giant evil mommy. But when the general we've known for 5 seconds is about to die, we take on a new form with a wing. And then we beat her. And the chapter ends about as fast as I just explained it. Outside of more exposition, that literally is all Act 6 is. I have no clue what makes people think that this chapter was well written, outside of it being more visually fun than the slog that was the rest of the story. Which, like, the final fight is fun, but not only does it not mean anything, the game also doesn't really have anything for it to mean. Let me explain. The entirety of chapter 1 is setting up plot elements and lore, but none of it actually sets the chapter itself up. Outside of one vision of the evil mommy, it's hard to call chapter 1 an arc. What exactly was this chapter about? At first, it felt like this chapter was setting up a rescue of the Sentinel, but that doesn't happen. Then maybe it feels like it could be a chapter setting up a fight with Scar, but that also is not what happens. Instead, this chapter actually feels like multiple Act 1s for different chapters stitched together. The lead up to Scar's imprisonment feels like it could have been a chapter in and of itself, and the chapter that introduces the organization meant to save the world also feels like an Act 1 for a different chapter about them. Act 6 then doesn't feel like a culmination to, well, anything. The climactic fight that we got was just kind of there. I mean, nothing sets up the backwards rain for the fight, and we do nothing to influence the war's initial start. The enemies just show up randomly, so it absolutely doesn't make sense that this is like a climax at all. And this is especially telling based on the character usage here. This Avenger shot is incredibly laughable because we don't know like half of these people. Like literally, 2 people here were just introduced right before this shot. And if you don't do his character quest, that means you don't know half of the people here. Also, small aside, his character quest is the best written thing in this game, just put that. The characters also don't do anything in Act 6, other than like fight fodder. Jian is set up to have some sort of payoff here, but not only is he basically introduced in this chapter, outside of a memory scene from before, we also don't get any payoff for him. I guess he didn't like this monster from the war before, but like, alright. To be fair though, his connection to this dude makes him and Jinsha, as well as Scar, feel like the only characters who were actually initially written into this script because they're the only ones with plot connections to anything that's going on. The ones where if they were written out, they would actually substantially change the story. Or well, I don't know about substantially. Well, like maybe for the future, because like I said, nothing has actually really happened yet. So writing anyone out at this point is, I guess, is possible. Like, let's also just look at the concept of Act 6 as a whole. It's kinda an all-out war scenario to protect the city, but like, we just got here. The entirety of the chapter before this was about setting up lore concepts and exposition. So like, we don't really know anybody in the town. There's really nobody that we're actually protecting, and this is especially telling because we don't get any perspectives from the town itself. This feels like an act that would be at the end of like a 3rd or a 4th chapter of a story. One in which we've already gotten close to these characters and this city, where battling to protect all of them would mean more than just noise. The same is true for the ending. The rover gets his new form, I guess because a prophecy wills it, not because he chooses to really do anything. I mean, he protects him, but is that really the climactic moment? We just fucking met this guy. It has no relation to his memories, and it seems like Rover doesn't really care about that stuff anymore. We're kind of just on the ride to stop monsters from reviving at this point, because people and prophecies told us. If you think about it, if we replaced Act 1 of the prologue with Act 6 of Chapter 1, would the story really feel any different? The characters would just tell us what all of this is anyway, and because there's nothing from previous chapters that's actually set up this conflict in Act 6 in any meaningful way, and because none of these characters have any semblance of an arc that stems from the previous acts, this really could just be swapped to the beginning of the game. I mean, we learned just as much about all these characters in this conflict than we had before this. This could just as easily been an introduction to all of these characters. We could have woken up in the middle of this war zone and introduced characters as we're fighting. That would actually be way more efficient, and it would be a different type of beginning to something like Genshin or Star Rail. And it would have been actually exciting to get to know all these characters from this giant war as they don't know you and don't trust you. It would have been also just more efficient. It would have just saved me countless hours, which honestly, this is really impressive. I've actually never seen something like this before where like a conclusion to an arc could easily just be the introduction. This act is terrible. This chapter is terrible. There's no theming, no characterization for characters, no arcs for characters, or the chapter as a whole. Weird pacing for the entire thing that feels like a car stuck in traffic, and a breakneck, out of place Act 6 that's a culmination to nothing that came before it. So, turns out, there's more story. So, let's talk about the story of 1.1. 1.1 sets itself up as something else that the rest of the story didn't do, and that's a focus on characters. Jinsha has gone off to save the Dragon Lord of the region and maybe fulfill the prophecy that she heard Scar tell her, that she's supposed to fight it. So, rather than going beat by beat, let's just cut to the chase with the 1.1 story. let's just tell you that it's bad. It exemplifies every problem that I've stated that the rest of the story has, but in a really concise way this time. This arc may seem like a character piece on its surface, something I would naturally gravitate towards, but at almost every given moment, we're forced to shy away from characters for the sake of more godforsaken exposition. The arc even starts with odd, unnecessary exposition. We have a dream about the dragon and the new location that we're supposed to head to, but instead of showing us the dream, the game decides to skip ahead a few days and then have our main character exposit about the dream that we had the night before with like a slideshow. Why are we not just showing the dream? Why is everything in this game reading like it was written in a bad book? This continues for the rest of the arc as Jinsha's teacher accompanies you on your mission to the island where the dragon is, where she is. But first, actually, I want to say that the island's concept is actually really badass. A place where time essentially is stopped. Because the dragon was wounded and it can control time, the time on the island got halted immediately, which leads to these really fantastic visuals of animals frozen in place and snow itself stopped mid-fall. It's really striking imagery, but we come to learn that that's all it really is. The concept of time wonkiness isn't really played around with in the story of this area, almost at all. Instead, we quickly get thrust into caves for some reason, where we stay for a majority of the chapter. The game also does the gotcha sin of introducing a new character for the simple sake of just having another 5-star pullable character for the patch, because the teacher character that you travel with gets quite literally nothing to do. Well, like every other character in this game, her actual only action is to once again stay behind to fight a random mob right before the climax. I wonder where we saw this before. Wuthering Waves is legitimately one of the worst gacha games I've ever seen with its character usage. I think you could take away like 90% of the characters in the entire story, and the story would be the exact same. But let's talk about the one character in this chapter that actually does matter, and one of the few characters that I argued was a character previously.
Madam Jinsey.
She's interesting on paper, and I say she's interesting on paper quite literally, as this arc actually tells her story from a book. That's right, this game takes exposition to another level by having our characters find a book that has her backstory in it, a backstory that she already knows, mind you, and having the game just read it to us. I mean, the cutscene's cool, but why did they tell it this way? At every given moment, this game takes away interesting reveals from its characters and instead explains them to the player as a third party. This chapter also clarifies something that the game has been doing the whole time that I never really noticed, or at least I wasn't able to verbalize. And that was that it never really sets anything up. Instead of setting scenarios up and then paying them off down the line, the game will do one of two things. Either something will be said, and then in a scene or two, that thing is brought back up, in which case this is only really set up on a technicality, or things are literally only brought up as the thing is actively happening. All action will be halted and the characters will stop to explain what is even going on in the present. Again, this is exposition, but it's also a special type of exposition that instead of explaining a lore detail or a character's history or backstory, which the game does do a lot still, it's explaining what a player is actively experiencing on the screen in the moment. It's actually really impressive, like in a terrible way, obviously. This game fucking story sucks. But like every other chapter in this game, I could see players being swayed by these honestly really beautiful cutscenes. These things look great, and they have some interesting and fun direction to them, particularly the one where the pair is climbing up the mountain near the climax. But that doesn't mean the story has any impact during them, because the character at the center of these scenes is so mismanaged and wasted. We spend half of this chapter trying to find her for some reason, and when we do, we really don't spend any time with her. Most of this chapter is just spelunking. She just explains who she is, or we read a book that does that for us, or the dragon explains their relationship. I know I've said this plenty of times, but this isn't how characters should work, like at all. And such a misunderstanding of character is a particular sore spot for a gacha game, because That's what they should be doing at a bare minimum with their stories, connecting us to their characters so that we feel an urge to spend money on them. Because that's what these games are about. This game feels like a gacha game with a past. A game that should have the story exist in skippable menus with the intent of having the combat shine. And I think that, well, they've already made that. There's a sort of creative ambivalence to this game's story. Throw shit at the wall and call it paint mentality. And I think the creators, they know this. This is why they rewrote 90% of it. Again, I compared this game to Genshin so much because, well, it's obvious where its inspiration has come from. I also think that Genshin, again, has really efficient storytelling. And while, at times, I can really hammer the issues that Genshin has in its story, there's still a heart at its core that shines through every now and then. Something that really is special. Whereas here, it's hard not to just view all the story as cynical box checking because it's something Genshin has that they felt that they needed. So no, this game's story isn't good, and it really is a masterclass of how you shouldn't start a long-running story. But hey, the combat's fucking sick! If you want me to keep reviewing this story, let me know. I keep shitting on it. Also, thank you to my patrons for making it to the end of this video. If you made it to the end, here's a cool character design. And if you're not a patron, you made it to the end, here's a Discord mod. That's pretty cool. Oh, also a new video about Penaconi's finale soon. It's gonna be really long. Thank you for watching, bye!